At first, the answer to the question of how the Jock Studio timeline will be looking like might just seem trivial and certainly not worthy of a 10,000 word explanation, since you just need to squish them 1 and 2 together, add lots of spice, and boom, you have already most of the work done. Such prospect would admittedly be very convenient, but where would be the fun in that, am I right? Perhaps unsurprisingly, things aren't as easy as just fusing them 1 and 2, since it has been stated on multiple occasions by the dev team and in its most official form in the Demo 2 content update, that the storylines we saw in the demos will mostly, keyword mostly, remain independent from the ones we'll get to see in the final game. Meaning that essentially we need to jump through a few, no more like a lot more hoops to get a reliable prediction. And to do so, we'll need to use the 2 greatest weapons in your arsenal: comparison and recycling, with the former being of great help to us, due to the fact that we have 2 previous Blitz titles that allow us to draw parallels between how things have been done in the past and what might be done in the future, while the latter is just plain old good resource management that the dev team will absolutely need in an effort to not make the game come out in 2069. Yet still, even our greatest weapons would be of no use to us were they locked in a box of which we lack the key. But fortunately for us, we are in possession of tons of different keys to help us solve this riddle, which are none other than what are colloquially called CGs, short for computer graphic, essentially just a fancy but abbreviated way to define a digital drawing, that in our specific case, however, indicates only the still images, which are usually close-up of characters drawn from a specific angle for important moments, which are not to be confused with the sprites, the front-facing drawing that make up most of what we see during the game, which are drawn and built to have as many variations as possible so that they can be used in every scenario as functional approximation of the huge variety of movements and expression you'd expect any given human to have when going about their day. Sprites and CGs thus work together to create the wider world of the game, with the CGs serving to highlight important moments, while the sprites fill in the gaps between those moments, by allowing the characters to express as vast of a range of emotions as possible in the day-to-day events. On a game development standpoint, however, both sprites and CGs require quite the insane amount of time to properly develop, but importantly, the sprites have a much bigger payoff when compared to the CGs due to the fact that, by their very nature, sprites will remain relevant from the very start of the game to the very end, regardless of the kind of scenarios that will play out. The reason why they are so flexible is that each set of arms, body, face, hair and outfit is, on a data level, its own separate entity. If it helps to better visualize it, think of the Jocks in sprite form essentially being a sexy version of Mr. Potato Head, with the only difference that the Jocks have literally hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of possible combinations that essentially allow the sprite to be used in every possible scenario through some simple programming. Unlike the sprites, however, the CGs are not at all as flexible. Despite the fact that there is some variation within the same CG, mainly in the face and eggplant region, since they represent specific moments, they can't be slapped everywhere without rhyme or reason, and thus it is imperative that the narrative must be built around the CGs. Think of what we see in the CGs as key events that, from a resource management point of view, must happen in the final game too, due to the amount of resources spent in creating such important yet inflexible assets. Understanding how these CGs will be recycled is, as such, probably the single most important part of this whole process, but nearly as important is the comparison with the previous games. Since every CG has a role that is important to define the pace of the game, it's possible to us to draw one-to-one comparisons between what we saw in the Jock Studio demos and what we got to see in the Camp Buddy games, allowing us to pinpoint with greater precision even when a CGs might end up being used in the final game. Still, no two games are alike, and there is one important difference between the Camp Buddies and Jock Studio.
Camp Buddy and Scoutmaster Season are both visual novels, which involve a lot of reading and a lot of clicking through things without actually interacting, and that is one thing that we definitely want Jock Studio to be able to be a little bit more of, where there's a lot more interaction for the player, where you're busy doing things a lot throughout the story and whatnot, and it's not just reading basically a book.
So as you can see this time around, it's not as simple as introducing a narrative with the occasional multiple choice question to determine the route. In Demo 2, we already got a taste of these mechanics that will make Jock Studio differ from Camp Buddy, And when I say we got a taste, I mean more so we got a little breadcrumb, at least when compared to their full scope in the final game. It is in fact accurate to say that although the coded data for most of these mechanics is correctly implemented and perfectly functional inside the game's code, what most of the gameplay mechanics miss is an effect on the outcome flowchart, which, in simple terms, means that any kind of interaction with every gameplay mechanic that doesn't directly correlate to the affection stat, it's ultimately meaningless in the outcome of Demo 2. So most of the gameplay features either have the role of tech demos, like in the case of the minigames, meaning that their point is just to show off a brief section of gameplay, or they are even more bare-boney, like the academic and shopping features, which are basically just billboards to announce the presence of these mechanics to all of those players that don't necessarily follow and dissect every single update released. Which is most people actually. I'm usually the one that does that. But getting back on track, the closest any of the gameplay mechanics come to impacting the story is how the ability stats serve as a multiplier along with the affection stat to determine the score of the filming minigame, which is still only numerical data that has no effect on the outcome flowchart. That said, me pointing out this lack of gameplay functionality is not meant to be a jab at the dev team, who, despite having had to probably cut a hefty amount of content from the second demo, since leftover data uncovered through bugs points to the statutory date offered to Ace by his chosen Jock as having been initially planned as a playable feature, they still managed to make Demo 2 not only an enjoyable experience but a remarkably put together one at that. Especially in view of the fact that many of the game's features, by their very nature, will only shine once the player has at their disposal the entire game for time to use them. And with that said, I'd confidently state that now we've understood the three principles we need to balance, and thus the dev also need to balance, to formulate a proper timeline of events for the full release of the game. Said three principles will thus be recycling, narrative and gameplay, which all need to work in unison to create the best experience possible. There is, however, one last important piece of info stemming from an almost entirely external source that we need to take into consideration. In the 1-year Kickstarter anniversary dev update, we find mentioned, for the first time, the very essential yet seemingly insignificant notion that the game will be split into several arcs, with the one mentioned in the dev update so far being Ace discovering and joining Jock Studio, seemingly 2 championship arcs, spring break, school festival arc, and lastly end of semester arc. However, the fact that they are openly stated to be several is not of any help in deciphering the general tempistics the game will assume, at least from a narrative point of view. But, to correct this lack of knowledge on our part, we need to make the more than reasonable assumption that Jock Studio will work under the almost universal 3-act story structure, which divides most given stories in a series of 3 consecutive and interconnected arcs, and for longer narratives, like in the case of Jock Studio, the 3-act structure will likely consequently trickle down and encompass smaller arcs, to be contained inside the bigger arcs, which will be the arcs mentioned in the dev update. So in case anyone has trouble visualizing it, think of Jock Studio as a multi-episode series, and the acts are the general block of episodes that make up the narrative, while the arcs would instead be the single episodes that themselves follow the 3-act structure just on a smaller scale. It's basically a giant Russian nesting doll if it helps to picture it. Lastly, there is one more small but important piece of data we can discern from the dev updates, that being how long the game will last in terms of in-game time. I won't needlessly beat around the bush, since I assume that you'd have realized by now that the presence of an end of semester arc implies that the game will last for around 5 or 6 months, but due to the RPG mechanics present in the game, we'll also very likely not see any or any significant time jumps from the moment that even dull days would be useful to work on Ace's stats or make him study or something along those lines. So by adding to this hotpot some more miscellaneous info, allow me to introduce to you the Jock Studio full game timeline. As far as general timing goes, it is perfectly reasonable to assume that the game will take place over Ace's second semester of freshman year, both because of Matt having the line,
"But you told me you would figure it out during winter break!"
and because Demo 1, in the 2.1 update, starts off the game on the 5th of January. When it comes to how the gameplay will actually start, however, If there is one thing I'm putting my money on, is certainly that the game will start in the same exact way as Demo 1, with Ace's dream sequence in which he dreams about his graduation day and this mystery person of his that he wants to thank with all of his heart. The dream will immediately be followed by Ace waking up to the sour realization that his purposeless life sucks, due to his own ability to make meaningful decisions, and he'll proceed to console himself via his favorite activity. This immediately gives us an incredibly strong hook to Ace's character, presenting all we need to know about him in just the first few minutes of gameplay, and setting him up not only just as the player's avatar, but also as a character in his own right. And it will be precisely his indecisiveness that we see in full display during the intro, the most important point of the first out of the game's 3 major narrative acts. I have thus dubbed this first one as Act 1 Ace Learns to be Decisive, which will include of course the first regular arc of the game of Ace discovering Jock Studio and meeting the Jocks. On that note, however, I don't think that the way Ace will be recruited in Jock Studio will match what we got to see in Demo 1, because the events of Demo 1 all start off from Matt giving Ace the quiz to decide the club, aka the love interest the player will get to have. Despite this relative importance in the game's first demo, however, the devs have said in the past that the quiz might not remain in the final game, and that it was mostly a tool used to decide on the initial route of the demo, and not necessarily thought to be a long-term solution. So, will we see the quiz in the final game? Will its functionality be altered or it will be removed completely? Hard to say exactly, since it's still a useful tool to start off the events, and might have further use later in the story when Ace actually needs to join a sports club, but it's not by any means irreplaceable. With that aside, we can now deduce that Matt will walk in on Ace doing his Ace things, and as the good best friend Matt is, he'll may or may not hand Ace the quiz before gently reminding his best friend that if he doesn't decide to make a change in his life, it will keep on sucking, which also means he'll never get to suck, so he really needs to do something about it. At this point, like in Demo 1, Ace just heads to class while he'll subsequently might compile the quiz, with or without player input depending on how the devs decide to go about it, but I wanna remind you all that regardless if Ace fills the quiz or not, he'll have to do a lot more things during the first morning on the final game compared to what we got to see in Demo 1. That will of course be due to the dozen or so different game mechanics the dev will need to introduce as early as possible since they make up the core of the game. Such introductions will, with approximately 100% certainty, be carried out by IO during the course of Ace's boring morning of scholarly activities, so that the player can learn right away about the health, academic and calendar apps, as well as the campus map, which is obviously needed for travel. Ideally, this first section of tutorial should be kept pretty brief, since I assume it's not ideal to delay the meeting of the love interest any more than needed. But at the same time, explaining to the player stuff like the calendar and school map is important, due to them being essential to, well, do most things in the game actually, and so are the academics and health app, since they always need to be taken in consideration from the very start, by the simple logic that falling behind on studies, or more simply starving Ace to death, will in all likeness bring about an instant game over. And so it's essential that the player must master them early, to avoid having one's first run being cut short. Once classes are over for Ace and we as the player are done with the tutorial session, we likely get to meet Jocks, which I know for the record is pronounced Jock, but between Jock and Jocks and Jock and Jocks and Jocks and Jocks, somebody's bound to get confused, so I'll stick with Jocks, who might or might not meet Ace as our blue-haired man tried to submit the quiz. And further, we'll get recruited in what Ace's little Ben said doesn't understand is a porn club, only to immediately receive our first task to go and fetch the 6 club members, aka love interest, from their respective sports practices. Now, I can already see some of you raise counterpoints to Ace meeting all 6 Jocks on the same day back to back, mainly because it might just end up feeling kinda clunky, and that perhaps it'd be too much for a single day. No, actually, for a single afternoon. But as a counterpoint to the counterpoint, I'd say that having Ace meet them all on the same day perhaps would also be the best option. Assuming that most players bought the game with the hope of getting to interact with their husbando as soon as possible, splitting up the Jocks in different days would mean forcing the player to spend multiple days having to interact with characters that they might not be interested in, which is not exactly ideal. However, at the same time, meeting all the Jocks in quick succession directly in the afternoon of day 1 might just end up feeling kinda video game quest-like, especially compared to the more natural way we got to meet the love interest in Camp Buddy. But on the other hand, due to the vastly different settings the Jocks are in compared to the intimate campgrounds of Camp Buddy, all athletes will rarely be in the same general area together, so Ace meeting them in an organic way like Keter does with the campers will generally be quite impossible, and although he could meet them all directly at Jock Studio, it's also unlikely the devs would go down the route when Demo 1 has already perfectly clustered encounters with each of them, which not only have 4 CGs per Jock, but also the dialogues and general events are already perfect showings for each of their individual personalities, and would thus require very minimal changes to be properly reused. So you can see why I feel it'd be best to have Ace go around the campus meeting all the Jocks on day 1, so that, by the afternoon, they can all be gathered at the pornographic studio, which, may I remind you, for Ace at this point in the story it will still be just a film club. On this note, I'd assume that the devs will be encouraged to keep this story bit in, since Ace not realizing the true nature of the club, it's, to be honest, funny as fuck and extremely iconic, which is also a further reason why I think all the Jock must be met on day 1. Having Ace recruit all 6 guys over the period of several days would just make it weird if the miscommunication error over the nature of the club would last that long, and it would kinda stretch the suspension of disbelief quite a bit, and especially since all of those who played the demo, so a sizable chunk of the player base, would know that the Jock was incoming, so stretching it out might just end up making it unfunny. As far as how this freakout scene will play out in the final game, I think that after Ace rendezvous all the Jocks at the studio, instead of the stripping scene, will be treated to Jocks holding a little meeting, during which everyone will use just vague enough language to not make it clear that it's a porn studio, but at the same time just explicit enough in its undertones that Ace starts to suspect something. So when he asks,
What the hell kind of films are we making exactly?
everybody will hit him with the
Porn. What else?
Cue Ace's subsequent freakout and him being delighted he stumbled into something so perfect. But unlike Demo 1, the Jocks would probably not start recording stuff just yet, since a not safe for work scene this early into the game would be quite uncharacteristic of Blitz, since Campari and the SFs have their first not safe for work scene on day 6 and 5 respectively. For this reason, instead of Ace assisting to a display of white fireworks, the day would probably just end with our main character going back to his dorm, presumably on cloud 69, but during the walk back he'll probably have to make his first big choice in the game, which will be deciding which Jocks he wants to walk besides with. This would allow the use of the See You Soon CG, and the presence of this artwork at this point in the game would be supported by the fact that, in Demo 1, all of the Jocks say they are headed somewhere that would require them to part way with Ace once they reach the dorms. To be more specific, Leo says he's headed to the karaoke, which is very probably outside of school. Avan still has cancelled business to attend to, so he's probably headed to the administrative building. Bryce is headed to his frat, which is quite far away from the dorms. Yuto has a makeup quiz to attend, so he's headed to the lecture hall. Zane doesn't really specify where he's headed, but considering GSA position relative to the dorms, he must pass by it to get where he needs to go. And Derek is literally the only one who goes against this, since he says he arrived at his stops, but there are no stops between the studio and the dorms. That said, however, it's important to specify that this line was written long before the devs were even sure there would have been a campus map. So this is probably an easy change to make, and since we know from Demo 2 that Derek doesn't live at the dorms, like all the other Jocks, he'll have to part ways with Ace in front of them, leaving our protagonist to go back to his room alone before going to bed. So that would probably conclude the first day of the demo, bringing us to day 2, which I assume will start with a brief introduction to the actions Ace can perform in his room, which, in the case you don't know since the game doesn't explain it, each action can either boost Ace's stats or change his mood, and additionally, sleeping actually allows him to charge up an extra energy bar that he can consume during the day. Additional energy that he'll soon start to need, since from this point onwards, I expect the game to open up a lot more, giving Ace the freedom to go around as he pleases as he starts to experience the first events with the Jocks. Among these events, I certainly expect to see some recycled ones from Demo 2, along with some new ones that will, however, remain relatively light in terms of activities. But we won't have to wait long for things to spice up. In fact, I also think that within the game's first 4 days, we also get to see the stripping CGs, which have been used in Demo 1 right before the not safe for work scene. But as I said beforehand, having any kind of sexy content directly on day 1 would be a bit too early, and additionally, these CGs are probably the Jock Studio equivalent of these other CGs from the Camp Buddy games, which are shown to the player on day 7 for Camp Buddy and on day 5 for Skull Master Season respectively. So in Jock Studio 2 they are probably due for a slightly later appearance. Even so, you still might say that having them placed between day 2 and day 4 is a bit too early in comparison to the Camp Buddies, but I'd argue that with Jock Studio's greater focus on sex as a theme and not just as a side activity, having the not safe for works elements being introduced early is probably expected. Not as early as day 1, but still a bit sooner than previous titles. Yet on this 6 CG specifically, there is still one more gripe which needs to be untangled. That being how many of these CGs the player will be able to see within one playthrough. The relevance of this question stems from the fact that in the Camp Buddy games, the player could only see one of these stripping CGs per playthrough. So for example, seeing Natsumi's CGs would automatically lock you out of seeing the others for the rest of that playthrough. But with Jock Studio's more open nature, this might not be a restriction that will apply to this new game. Ace could very well in fact go to 6 different events at different hours of the day across maybe a couple of different days that will allow him to see all the love interest strip. But just because he can in theory doesn't necessarily mean that he will in practice. Or does it? If we look at the context around 2 of these stripping CGs, we find out how 2 of them are somewhat particular, specifically Avance and Derek's. Starting off with Derek's, it's important to note that in Demo 1, we saw how the way Ace recognizes him as the king is by looking at the tattoo on his back, which is quite the important plot point and not exactly something that would be worthy of being shoved as a side note in some obligatory dialogue if the player doesn't end up seeing the CG of Derek stripping. So presumably, the devs will need for the player to come across this CG one way or another, so that Ace uncovering Derek as the king can be an important and meaningful moment regardless of the route the player will end up choosing. And a very similar discourse could be applied to Avan, since Ace mentions when he looks at Avan stripping that seeing him undress is like unwrapping a birthday present, which at first might sound out of place, until you remember that Avan's birthday happens on January 9th, and the game starts on January 5th, so that means that Avan's birthday will happen exactly on day 5 of the game. Now, as we'll see in a moment, day 5 will probably be taken up by a group activity, but if the devs decide to actually make the birthday being acknowledged in their storyline, it would be a perfect time for Ace to whip out the birthday present comparison if Avan tells him that his birthday will be tomorrow or in a few days time. And it might also end up being an important moment for Avan, since it could be used, for example, to show how he doesn't intend to stop working even on his birthday. So with 2 out of 6 jocks already having a strong reason for why it'd be important to show their stripping CGs to the player, even if admittedly Derek's reasoning is quite a bit stronger than Avan's, you may see why the devs would wanna perhaps allow their player to experience more than one jock stripping scene, either by making them obligatory or by strongly suggesting to the player that they might wanna go in X location at X time of day to see something spicy. And if the player still doesn't go there, they are either gonna miss out on important info or receive it in a less focused way, which at that point would be the player's fault and not at all an issue with the game itself. A similar approach wouldn't actually be something new for Blitz games, since something similar can also happen in Camp Buddy. If, during Nature Day, you don't go in the forest to meet Yuichi and his dog Yuki, but later on end up going down his route anyway, Keitaro will actually meet Yuki for the first time after the Sport Fest, but without seeing the proper CG of Yuki and Yuichi together. So I'd say it's entirely possible for something similar to apply to Jock Studio if the player doesn't follow the game scenes. Moving on to the end of the school week, so on day 5, By this point the player should have grown accustomed to all the day-to-day mechanics, which also include the shop system, the inventory system and the contact log, and will also have the chance to get to know the Jocks in one-on-one time with Ace. So day 5 would be prime time to introduce the first club activity, which also means introducing the first minigame and a bit of the group dynamic along with it. Regarding this first group activity, I very much see the introduction to the workout minigame staying the same as what we saw in Demo 2, with the player being shown the stripping in locker CG that, if it happens on day 5, would be perfectly in line with what we saw in the Camp Buddy games, with the group shower scene happen on day 6 and 5 respectively. This would allow us to see a bit more of the group and pairs dynamic we would have probably gotten a taste of in the day 1 club meeting. And once everybody is done changing, the player will have the chance to play the workout minigame and boost the character stats. However, and crucially, I want to specify that at the end of the workout, the shower scene with the love interest, as we saw it in Demo 2, might not happen for one quite simple reason. It might just be a bit too early in the game to have a full-on genitalia showing not safe for work scene with the love interest, from the moment that Blitz usually tends to signify the root lock with the love interest showing cock for the first time. We saw it in Camp Buddy, where right after the end of the sports fest there is the first proper not safe for work scene with the love interest, and in Codemasters season, where right after the shower scene we get to have an intimate moment with the love interest in the stall. And when it comes to days, the root lock in Camp Buddy happens on day 8, and in Codemasters season on day 5. So we would be kinda matching time-wise with the previous titles, as I said previously. In light of this, it seems perfectly appropriate to show the shower scene right after the workout, as we saw in Demo 2. But the devs might decide not to do it yet, because by this point we might have simply not spent enough time with the love interests yet. Which at first sounds odd, because 5 days were enough in Codemasters season, and we have already said that the shower scene happening on day 5 is a good match to the Camp Buddies, so why wouldn't the root lock also happen? Such line of thought, however, doesn't take into consideration the fact that not only a root lock is a lot more of a significant event compared to a group stripping scene, but in Camp Buddy, the single days are long! In fact, among those who play them, I bet many wouldn't say that the events of the first Camp Buddy happen in only a month's worth of in-game time, and more or less the same applies to Codemasters season. Furthermore, in the Camp Buddies, the protagonist has the luxury of spending all of his waking hours with the love interest, which is a privilege Ace doesn't have, since at least half of his day is bound to be taken up by lessons and by doing other things like, for example, eating and studying. So even if the amount of days is the same, the time actually spent getting to know the love interest would be considerably less in Jock Studio. By the time of the first workout minigame, Ace would have probably not gotten to interact with a single love interest more than 2 or maybe 3 times. So that wouldn't really justify a root lock and thus showing the love interest naked already on day 5. It is likely as such that they'd want to wait a little more to drop the root lock hammer. And for this reason, we'll probably just have Ace not shower with the Jock and head to his dorm to unlock the self-pleasure feature, either on the same evening or more probably on the next day like we saw in Demo 2, which would match with the way Camp Buddy did it by having the first ever not safe for work scene be the protagonist beating his mate after seeing the group naked. At this point, I assume that there'll be a let's catch up event with Matt, like the one we got to see in day 2 of the second demo. However, instead of having it at the mess hall, I see as a real possibility the fact that they might decide to not reuse that specific Matt event in favor of moving it to the city, because yes, a city is planned for Jock Studio, and realistically, I think it's imperative it must be introduced in the first playable weekend. For the simple reason that having the whole day free is actually kind of a gameplay detriment at this point, because with many of the game's mechanics that still need to be introduced, mainly those related to the studio, and without any major story bits to cover, having to fill in 2 whole days of free time with just the campus mechanics and a couple of events might just be a little tough. So it'd be a perfect time to introduce the city, both because if the deal where Matt offers pizzas to Ace is kept in the final game, it might be convenient to introduce the city at this point so that Matt can keep his promise, and because introducing the city would for sure introduce new mechanics that need new tutorials, so a perfect way to fill up time. Especially because it makes sense at this point to introduce the date mechanics and the dining minigame, either by having Ace and the love interest go on more of a friendly date as a first time, Or, and more intriguingly in my opinion, have the tutorial date be the pizza hangout with Matt, so that the player has a chance to experience all or most of the mechanics of the date in a trial run before actually having to use them with the love interest. After this, I assume there will be another full week in which we'll simply see more events from the Jocks leading up to the first photoshoot minigame on the second Friday, during which, or at most during the subsequent weekend, there will be the root lock. I feel pretty confident in saying this because at this point the player would have played for more than 12 days, and it just seems like the perfect amount of time to get the root lock in. 2 weeks are ideal because 1 week might be a bit too little considering what I said beforehand, and a root lock at 3 weeks instead might actually be too much because that would be approaching on a month worth of in-game time, which might just end up feeling too long all things considered. The root lock would also match another important thing that will happen at around this time, it being the Ace learns to be decisive act approaching its end, since a root lock means that, like the player, Ace has now chosen the guy he wants to romance, and thus one of his probable first acts upon having this realization would be deciding to join the same sports club as his crush, to make sure he can spend as much time as possible with him. I see this decision coming probably after a chit chat with Matt, in which everyone's favorite green-wearing straight ally will tell dear Ace that if he clearly has feeling for this guy, he should do something proactive to get closer to him, instead of probably just beating his meat while thinking of his crush. Ace would of course end up deciding to listen to Matt's advice and sign up for the club's tryout on the next Monday, which will also make him share a locker room and a shower room with his crush, which in turn probably means that at this point in the story, we'll get to see the shower scene, complete with Ace stripping in front of the love interest right beforehand. On top of that, the shower scene and their respective voice lines are already perfectly suited to this new scenario, from the moment that the only real difference between the demos and the final one would be which club members risk hearing Ace and his love interest messing around. But since among those lines of dialogue, the other members are always referred to with some variation of the others and that's it, the shower scene can basically be translated one-on-one in this new context. But beyond the spicy stuff, as you might imagine, Ace joining a sports club would also mark the end of the Meeting the Jocks arc and the start of the New to the Sports Club arc, which will also probably kick off the act that happens right after the Ace learns to be decisive act, it being one of 2 acts dedicated to the love interest, of which I've dubbed this first one Act 2, the love interest's problem. Now that Ace will spend more time with the love interest, we'll start to know more about them and thus start to learn about what's the problem at the core of their character. If you wanna know about what this problem might be, well, guess you'll have to watch my next video on the topic. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here, because we need to keep on focusing on our timeline, since stuff is about to get real juicy. It is probable that as Ace is getting adjusted to a new sporty life, meeting his crush's clubmate and getting ready for the first championship of the semester, Jack should be prepping up for the end of week activity by delegating the Jocks to train and pose a little more before getting them to have the first fapping session on camera, which of course would come along with the player experiencing the filming minigame for the first time. This first edition of the filming minigame specifically will likely just feature the solo option. It will be a way to introduce to the player the base mechanics of the minigame without having to already layer on top of it all the various position and multipliers that will come with the duo scenarios. Taking this chance to talk about the filming minigame a bit more broadly, one major difference we'll see in the final game compared to Demo 2 is the functioning of this most juicy of minigames, because it seems that in Demo 2, the minigame was rigged by the devs to almost always give a good result, and moreover it always leads to a full CG scene, no matter the actual quality of the performance. While for the Jocks' first time on camera, which as I said will only feature the solo scenes, the minigame might still be rigged since it needs to act both as a tutorial and ensure the player gets to see at least one nosy for work CG, it is likely that from then onwards, reaching 3 stars while playing will become an essential requirement to unlock the CG associated to the point in the story, or the specific combination of characters. Add to that, the filming minigame seems to essentially take the spot of the preliminary minigames in the Camp Buddies, meaning that succeeding in this minigame, along with the dating ones, is essential to get the good endings. To get the bad ones instead, you either need to fail the minigames or never choose your actual love interest when Ace gets paired up with another jock, which for the record you can already do in Demo 2. And additionally, it's another reason for why the root lock has to happen before the filming minigame, so you can start to work towards the bad ending already by giving poor performances that affect your affection negatively. After this first film, two very important things will likely happen. One is that during the next week we'll get introduced to the upgrade system of the studio, since the first money will have started to come in. And secondly, we'll see the last proper event we can deduce at this time, that being probably Ace and the love interest going to their first proper romantic date. As I said beforehand, it is possible that Ace would have gotten to go on a date with the love interest as early as the first weekend, depending on how the devs decide to go about it. But those days will, in all likeliness, as I already said, be more so hangouts and not real romantic dates. On the third weekend, however, Ace and the jocks of his choosing would have gotten to grow a lot closer, and since Ace will have by now seen them in their most private moments, it makes sense they decide the time is right for an actual date, which in all likeliness from a gameplay standpoint wouldn't be too different from the ones that might have come beforehand. But from a story perspective, the characters would feel the weight of the event, since it'd be more significant than a friendly hangout with a guy you just kinda like. At this point, there aren't many things left from demos we can translate to the final timeline, since the only remaining ones are the closet scene and the BJ scene on camera, and I think they're gonna play out pretty much identically to what we got to see in Demo 2. Ace will be spending the week getting ready for his first film, presumably with his crush, unless you wanna go for the bad ending. Then a photoshoot or something similar on Thursday will pent up the guys and lead to the closet scene, which will lead to Jack cock-blocking, which will in turn lead to an explosive first film on the next day. Now, with all of that out of the way, some of you may have noticed that there are still a few CGs that I have not specifically placed in the timeline, which are the Ace in Class CG, the special Jock Studio handshake CG, and the Jocks in Bed CGs, for the simple reason that realistically, they could be slapped almost literally at any point in the story, so they don't hold much weight in terms of determining the sequence of events. Ace is gonna be in class most days of the week, so seeing him sitting and attending lessons will hardly be a rare event. The special handshake is a cute moment that shows off the bond between the club members, but it can realistically be placed anywhere between the first film and the very end of the game. And lastly, we know from the dev update that the Jocks in Bed CGs will happen as a result of a successful date, but like the handshake, the when is impossible to determine and doesn't really impact the timeline of events either way. Oh, and also, before I forget, basically all of these comic panels can be put anywhere within the early game. They don't really matter that much. And so where does that leave us? Having run out of content from the demos and from the dev updates, we should probably stop here, but I wouldn't be train rope if I stop this soon, and neither would I post a video where I say nothing for a good chunk of the runtime, so let's continue. Now, at around the first filming scene with sex, I think that the game is gonna start to shift its focus completely, moving it from Ace to the love interest in question, due to the fact that at this point, Ace has developed enough to get rid of his indecisiveness, so it is likely that we would have seen up to this point what will end up being the bulk but not all of his character arc, making it the right time to fully put the attention on the love interest, because now that Ace is in the same sports club as his crush, and in general they also started to sort of date, it will be harder and harder for the love interest to hide what he might consider the more unsightly sides of himself. This process might also just be accelerated by what I like to call the injury arc, in which your dear jock of choice will unfortunately hurt himself practicing his respective sport. So Ace will need to stick by his boyfriend's side and heal him back to health, with some special medicine mixed in, I assume. Now, even if you ignore the high risk of injury that playing a sport provides, and the fact that one person falling ill and the other having to take care of them is like one of the most common tropes in BL, and to be honest, even in general romance, there are two further pieces of evidence that suggest that something like this will most likely happen. Or, to be even more precise, I'd say these are not just suggestions, but clear examples of Chekhov's gun, which, for those not in the know, is the narrative principle that dictates that in a story, everything is and should be there for a reason. Example, if there is a gun on the table in a scene, then somebody will likely end up using it. If the gun is not previously established to be there and someone pulls it out of their ass to use it, or if the gun is there and does not get used, things are no bueno with the story, because Chekhov's gun's principle has not been respected. The first example of Chekhov's gun in the Jock Studio demo regards none other than Zane, who, like some of you may already know if you have been following me on Reddit, has athlete tape on his right shoulder every time he engages in physical activities. This probably means that his right shoulder has a higher risk of injury than normal, so I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the story the joints were to pop out and the intervention of Nurse Ace will be required. And by this principle, if we make the reasonable assumption that the story beats need to parallel each other in all the routes like it happens in Camp Buddy, Zane won't be the only one benefiting of Nurse Ace's special care in his own route. With that said, the second example of Chekhov's gun in the game, which is more like a no, not even that, a combusting gun, is the presence of the medical center at Olympus U, who has been specifically labeled as such in a past dev update. So you can see why there will be no use in having such a building if the devs are not gonna use it. And additionally, considering the current pacing, it is likely that the injury arc will happen at around the time the first actual championship will take place, which will surely cause some drama, especially if the love interest ends up not being able to compete. With that out of the way, after Ace will be done worrying for his lover health, he'll probably have to soon worry about himself, considering that by now we'll probably be in the tail end of March, and according to the academic app in Demo 2, and also like general logic, between the end of March and the start of April, our dear Ace will have to get his head out of his lover crotch and slam it onto the books, to make sure he isn't failing the midterms. But if he manages to pass, his reward will be going to the beach along with our mighty sexy musky jocks, which will all glisten in the sunlight like vampires for how pretty they'll look in their swimming costumes. Thus, we'll probably be treated to the spring break arc, which will also mean that we are about halfway done with the game, and being at the midpoint of the story also presents us with a very obvious parallel with the Camp Buddies, in which, if you recall, by the midpoint of each playthrough, we were presented with a first confession in which our lovebirds stop being just sort of dating and have more of a real declaration of feelings, in which they make clear how much they mean for each other. In this case, I see no reason for why this pattern shouldn't be followed, since having the Jock and Ace officially become boyfriends by the midpoint of the game is not only great timing, but also extra lovely if they end up confessing on a beach, which, as far as love confession goes, would actually be a first for Blitz. However, I want to specify that this confession won't just happen because we hit a certain amount of days played. No. I specifically believe that the confession will happen as a result of Ace managing to, mostly, solve the love interest's main problem, which will encourage our chosen Jock to confess his feelings because he'll have truly understood that Ace is someone special for him, and in all likeness, the only person that understands him for real. Yet, cutting down a tree doesn't also mean killing its roots, since as we saw once more in the Camp Buddies beforehand, the last third and thus last act of the game will focus on discovering the root of the love interest's main problem, which will need to be eradicated to truly solve the issue at the core of their respective characters. And, once more echoing the events of Camp Buddy and Scout Master season, and honestly real life to be honest, the root of those problems are probably within the family. But I don't think that the Act 3, the problem's root as I've dubbed it, will start with Ace getting to know his in-laws right away. After the beach arc, we can assume that we'll be treated to a bit of a more relaxed arc, that will likely deal with getting ready for the second championship of the season. This chiller arc will not only allow us to take a bit of a breather after the big events of the confession, but will also likely start to give us some more tidbits on the love interest's background and backstory. Once that's done, we'll likely be thrown straight into the penultimate arc among the already announced ones, that being the school festival arc, which will take place at around the end of May, start of June, because animes usually like to do those in the summer, and it also makes sense from a narrative point of view, since it would, probably, coincide with the second championship, which makes the festival a way to celebrate probably the biggest sports event of the season, and by having at this point in the story, it likely still leaves space for the probable last arc of the game, it being the end of semester arc. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here, because the school festival arc might just end up being one of the most plot relevant arcs in the game, since if you think about it, usually it makes sense if the school administration would want each club to do something during the festival, maybe setting up a special booth, or showing off one of their projects. But whatever this something might end up being, is in a likeness something that Jocks Studio can't do without drastically altering their, well, kind of activities. So it would be logical to assume that our dear Jocks would be pretty stressed out to come up with something in order to protect their innocent film club facade, and in this high-stress scenario, where the chance of being outed is sky high, I'd expect something problematic to bubble up, that may or may not be related to everybody's least favorite Frenchman. But in general, whatever this is, it will probably pick up Ace's character arc, which will have never really stopped, just continues more so in the background, and present him with one final challenge for him to overcome, and show how much he has grown in his ability to make important decisions over the last few months. Since I'd assume that Ace, at this point in the story where the club will be in danger of being shut down and all of the members will risk getting expelled, will find himself having to choose between his newly found purpose and life calling as a porn director, or saving his friends and boyfriend from an unsightly fate. To give an example of what I mean, I think that Ace could be put in a situation where he'd have to either stay silent and walk free with his prospects as a future porn director intact, or take all the blame and bail the rest of the guys out. Ace would, of course, choose the latter, highlighting not only his good morality, at least in the good endings I assume, but also he would have realized by this point that even if what he wanted for all his life was a purpose, what he really needs to be happy is just somebody by his side to love. Now, depending on how the story goes, Ace and the club at large might just end up being bailed out completely from the situation. But what would not change is the fact that in all of this shitstorm, there would probably be quite the audience, since it's likely that the family of the students would start arriving at the festival. So it is also probable that during this arc, Ace will make acquaintances with his boyfriend's relatives, or meet the extended family if he already met some of the most plot-relevant future in-laws during the school year. Once the school festival will be over and the Jocks will have managed to, I don't wanna say having saved the Jock Studio, but at least managed to not get expelled, we'll likely be rolling into the end of semester arc, which, despite the name, might not end up being the last arc of the game. Let me explain. In Cambodian's commerce season, the credits rolled before a brief epilogue dedicated to the couple we paired up together. If it would be the same for Jock Studio, the end of semester arc would just play out by finally getting to the root of the love interest problems, via confrontation with the family, and Ace declaring his everlasting love to the love interest, which will imply that the relationship is meant to last. But, as a counter-argument to the final confession happening in this arc, unlike the camp buddies, which have a greater focus on the camp as a physical place and as a community, Jock Studio does prospect itself to have more of a focus on the how the relationship and story happened compared to the where. Camp Buddy is, from day one, set up as a place that is worth preserving, because it creates an everlasting community that acts as one big family, while Jock Studio, and even the game as a whole, are more transitory in their nature. University is a phase of life, not a home that you want to stay in permanently, and Jock Studio as the club will also probably not last forever. It will either be shut down at some point, or all the members will leave because they have graduated. So, in virtue of the fact that Jock Studio is not meant to last, it would make sense if the final arc of the game would happen after the end of the second semester. In this case, the end of semester arc will be dedicated to wrapping up all the storylines that are intrinsically related to the university as a place, while the true end of the game, and thus the end of the love interest arc, might take place after the closing of the school year, to give uncontested center stage to the most pivotal of moments in the story. after the school year ends, it would perhaps be possible for Ace to go and visit his boyfriend at his home. And once there, the relationship will reach an emotional climax, due to the family dynamics at play being amped up to 100 since we found ourselves in their literal home turf. Experiencing this kind of tension in the most vulnerable of places for a love interest, that being his home, will likely lead to one final confession of true and everlasting love between lovebirds, which will likely give the love interest the courage to finally confront his family head-on about the struggles he experienced, for what is likely to amount to his entire life, and finally eradicating the roots of the conflict that has plagued him for so long. From then on, the credits will likely roll, but not before we'll be treated to a glimpse into the serene dating life that Ace and our chosen Jock will have obtained after fighting so hard for it, which will be very much a deserved happy ending for them. Or alternatively, everything will have gone to shit if the player decided to do the bad ending. But if you like to make these characters suffer, I won't judge. I do too. And after the credits will have rolled, I think nobody pictures a world in which we will not get a 3 years time skip, in which we'll finally see Ace graduate and tell us who really is the most important person for him. Followed, of course, by one last sweet and probably one last spicy scene to show how the love between our main couple has lasted all these years. Again, unless you decided to go for the bad ending, in which case the only thing the non-existent epilogue will give you is probably crippling depression. So here is one last look at the entire timeline, which you can see in full, and most importantly I think, uncensored over on the Earthless Jocks Studio subreddit, if you wanna go there and take a look. Before concluding this video, however, I wanna give a small moment of satisfaction to all of those among you who aren't content with mere suppositions, and want to instead crunch on some real numbers. So I provided the Statistical Analysis King, aka my good friend Novel Reader, with some data on the Camp Buddy timeline, to see how it could reflect on the Jock Studio one, and here are the results. As you can see, in doing the analysis, we separated the actual number of in-game days from the days that are actually playable. But for our purposes, we'll be only looking at this last category, from the moment that, as I said previously, Jock Studio will probably not have any significant time skip, due to the presence of the RPG mechanics in the game. If you wanna see the full breakdown, feel free to head over to Reddit where you can find it in full. With this distinction in mind, Novel calculated for me the percentage between the most significant events of each route, which I've categorized as the time between the start of the game and the first not safe for work scene, the first not safe for work scene and the first not safe for work scene with the love interest, which matches the route lock, the first not safe for work scene with the love interest and the first proper sex, the first proper sex and the midpoint confession, the midpoint confession and the final confession and the rolling of credits, and lastly how many days the epilogue takes up, with this being the raw data for each route and this being the resulting average percentages. If we apply what we see here to the 180-ish days of Jock Studio, we get a spread of days that looks something like this, which is not exactly a word beater when it comes to accuracy, but what ends up skewing these results into not being an accurate representation of what will probably end up being the real Jock Studio timeline is mainly the first category, which is nothing short of exaggerated because there is no way we'll need to wait that long for the first spicy scene. But the rest of the time frames are actually pretty accurate, so if you give 5 days to the first not safe work scene to appear, and divide the remaining 38 days between the two central intervals, we get something that already looks a lot more close to what we might end up actually getting. For further accuracy, we can also scrape off a few days from the final confession and the rolling of credits and the epilogue, and we get something like this, with 5 days from the start of the game to the first no safe work scene, which matches our calculations, 14 days between the first no safe work scene and the first no safe work scene with the love interest, which falls in the predicted time frame between Ace fapping and the love interest shower scene, 13 days between the first no safe work scene with the love interest and the first proper sex scene, which also fall within the predicted 2 weeks that Ace will need to wait to finally have sex with his crush after he joins the sports club, 47 days between the first proper sex scene and the midpoint confession, which is a bit on the lower side for this time frame, but it compensates since between the midpoint confession and the final confession there would be about 97 days, which is a bit on the higher side instead, then 3 days between the final confession and the rolling of credits, and lastly 1 day of epilogue. Of course, all of these are all suppositions, so take them more as rough estimates rather than hard-on predictions, as well as this entire video to be honest, because the point of a theory is that it's just a theory, a very gay theory in this case, and thus it can be proven wrong at any moment, except for the gay part. This theory is kinda undeniably very gay. But anyway, that's all I have for you today, and if you really can't wait for my next video to come out in a week from now, and you are at least 18 years old, feel free to pass by on Earthless Jock Studio, where you'll find me posting daily polls and updated theories whenever new content gets released. I also wanna thank all the wonderful people that helped to make this video possible. Of course, my amazing artist Erin, who drew my avatar and the thumbnail for this video, my co-theorists Steph and Joshee, who ever so graciously are always willing to listen to my ramblings, and last but not least Everdin and Novel Reader, who have helped me out with some minor parts of the editing process. That said, I was your host Ryan Europe, and this has been the Jock Studio Full Game Timeline.